Hello everyone, my name is Simon. I'm currently driving my old camper van across one of the many dense forest areas in the south of Yorkshire with no one but my dog Marcia, who's currently laying on her fluffy bed, relentlessly chewing on her already half-devoured toy. Despite the evening sun slowly setting, the light is still brightly shining through the trees, giving the whole forest that mystical haze you often imagine in fairy tales. But perhaps the things that I cherish most about these woods are the memories I shared here many years ago with Sophie. We'd drive through this exact area, sometimes parking our camper in a caravan campsite about half an hour from here. From there, we'd usually hike 15 to 20 kilometers across vast valleys, lakes, and muddy mountainsides. We'd always stop by the pub near our campsite for an evening of hot food and cold beverages. Then, go camping again the very next morning. Those were the days. Everything was perfect, until the cancer unfortunately got to her. Pancreatic cancer, to be specific. It spread quickly. After 3 months it was already at stage 4, with no signs of slowing down. I got 2 months of paid leave from my job, meaning I could care for Sophie 24/7 and be by her side all the time. Things got worse, however, as she was gone within only 2 months. 5 months from the time she was diagnosed to her last day on this earth. It all happened so fast. It's been 2 weeks since she passed, and 2 weeks since I quit my job. I just couldn't handle it. I need some time to process this. So I'm taking our beloved border collie Marcia into the woods where we practically lived during our days off. At this point, these woods became like a second home to us. With each passing road sign I drive by, I get reminded of all the off-road hiking trails we'd take, picking berries, gathering wood for a fire, and cooking steak and potatoes after a day's worth of hiking. Today I was hoping to do all of that, but as I glanced at the clock inside my RV, I noticed it's already gone 6:45, meaning that I have just under 2 hours of sunlight left. Luckily, I noticed a large space right next to an opening to the forest, big enough for me to park my camper van. So I slowed the old bugger down and parked just on the inside of the forest. As soon as I stepped out of the van, I felt the cool autumn seeping over me. I'm wearing a thick coat today, and I brought the grey beanie Sophie got me for Christmas last year, so the weather would be the last of my worries. I looked up at the evening sky. I could tell that the sun was setting quickly, so unless I wanted to eat cold food for dinner tonight, I had to hurry for firewood. "Come on, Marcia," I commanded gently, before locking the door to my camper. Together, me and Marcia set off into the forest. I counted my steps carefully, all the way up to 100, as at this time I did not intend on trekking too deep into the forest and didn't want to lose sight of my camper. I looked behind me. I let out a sigh of relief as my camper was still in good sight. I began collecting dry oak sticks, breaking them up and putting them in my bag of tinder. I heard Marcia barking at something a few meters behind me. At first I thought she probably saw a squirrel or some other wild animal, which wouldn't surprise me, as these woods are also home to a fairly large population of red deer, so I decided to check up on her. When I got to her, she stood shivering and snarling, tilting her head slightly, as if she saw something in the distance. I looked around for a minute and didn't see anything that would indicate to animals in this area, but Marcia was still in distress. I calmed her down by stroking her softly on her long neck. After I lifted my hand off of her, I noticed a human footprint, about the same size as my own foot, but a slightly different shoe print. It was rather fresh, but since I didn't see anyone in the distance, I assumed it was probably another hiker, or maybe a hunter. "Hello?" I said, as a light shiver came over me. No response. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of seeing just a single footprint and no others. Given Marcia's state, I thought it'd be wise to make my way back to the camper. I heard a tiny pebble hit the tree to my right, and as I turned around, I saw what I thought was a hooded man running down the hill in the distance. "Hey!" I shouted, hoping my eyes mistook the man I saw for just some kid who was messing with me. "All right, Marcia, let's go," I said after looking up at the sky, seeing that the sun was starting to set. As we began turning around, I heard a twig snap, not too far away from me. I put one hand on my Swiss Army knife, just in case things got ugly. Nothing. All I heard was the trees swaying with the light breeze, and the occasional birds singing. Without saying a word, I quickly turned around and sped back to the camper. I decided not to risk staying out in the woods much longer, even if I was only a minute away from my camper. One thing I learned being out in the woods all these years is that you must always trust your instincts. Big or small, and no matter how irrational they may seem, it's always good to be on the safe side. Anyways, back at the camper, I set out my rain cover on the side. Afterwards, I took out my portable stove and placed it on my fold-out table. I diced the steak into thick slices, marinated it in some vinegar, soy sauce and black pepper. I then set out my small metal stove on the corner of the table. I took out my matches and lit the kindling. Looking over to my left to see if the man, kid or whoever was still around, turns out they must have went away, as I heard nothing but complete ambience of the forest. I carried on feeding the fire with progressively larger sticks. Once the fire got hot enough, I poured some filtered water into a pan while I waited for it to boil. I quickly diced 3 medium-sized potatoes. Once boiled, I put the potatoes on for about 10 to 12 minutes. I then walked towards the metal steps that go into the inside of the camper, sat down, and reached into my knapsack. I opened the small side pocket and took out a slim joint I rolled earlier that day. I put my lips around the butt of the joint, shielded it with my left hand, and lit the tip with my right hand. As I inhaled the smoky, earthy herb, I felt a very light haze come over me, an almost ethereal sense of peace. All of my senses came together to create an amalgamation of bliss. The constant sound of boiling potatoes, the smell of my ridiculously good steak, the treetops brushing against the quiet wind, Marcia quietly licking her paws, and the sun setting just in front of me. For the first time in a few months, I felt truly at peace. It's been over 5 years since I last had a cheeky smoke, and I suppose I never would have brought it upon myself to light another joint, if not for Sophie's passing. I used to smoke a lot when I was younger, but after a good amount of nagging from Sophie, I decided to quit for her. Oh well, life works in funny ways, I suppose. I took another hit and squinted my eyes. If I'm not mistaken, I believe I just saw a hooded figure peering behind the tree. At first I thought my intoxicated mind was playing tricks at me, but then I stood up and focused my gaze on the tree. It was without a doubt a man in his mid-30s or early 40s. He stood at about average height, with a freakishly perfect posture. He had his hands in his pockets, and he wasn't moving an inch. I must admit I was spooked pretty well, as I was out here practically alone, with only a few drivers passing through every hour, and the nearest town being 10 kilometers south of this trail. Upon closer inspection, I noticed the man had nothing on him, no backpack or rucksack. Could he have wandered off too far into the woods? Could he be lost? Or did I just find the person Marcia was barking at before? "Excuse me." The man stood as he was, only blinking, but otherwise he was as still as the tree he was hiding behind. Growled Marcia, sharing my frustration. "What do you want?" Still the man didn't budge. I was already quite fearful. My mind quickly searched for solutions. The easiest and most effective was to run to the back of the RV and get my father's old rifle. although I only had one bullet. Right, that's it, I whispered to myself. Running out of patience and becoming more on edge, I turned around and stepped into the camper. I hurried to the back of the camper as quick as I could, as I didn't want the man to quickly sneak up behind me. I rummaged through my spare camping gear under the bed, tossing my sleeping bag and my thermos towards the wall. I picked up the wooden handle of the rifle and hurried outside. I rose the rifle up to my shoulders and loaded the rifle, hoping this would be enough to scare the man away. I held it up, pointing the scope in his direction, and held it for 10 seconds. My heart started racing, as the possibility of there being more people in the woods crossed my mind. Luckily, the man started to back away, behind the tree, and I heard his footsteps in the distance, indicating to me that he went the opposite way, deeper into the dense forest. I gazed into the dark forest for a good minute, checking if he was really gone. When I was satisfied, I looked down at Marcia, who was also on high alert. "Come on, Marcia. Inside," I commanded. She stepped inside the camper. I threw my rifle into the camper shortly after and quickly put away the stove, pots, and the table. By this point, my dinner had cooled down, but I didn't mind. As long as I got out of here in one piece, I didn't mind having a cold steak. I chucked everything into the vehicle, stepped inside, and firmly locked the door. I also made sure to check if every window was closed, which it thankfully was. Quickly, I organized the equipment I threw in to make space inside and sat down on the driver's seat. I turned the engine on and rushed out of there. About 20 minutes down the road, I noticed a sign for a caravan campsite about 2 miles down the road, so I carried on down. Just a few moments later, I saw a clearing with around 15 camper vans on it. I let out a sigh of relief, and when I looked behind me, I saw Marcia panting happily. I turned back around to face the road as I drove into the entrance of the campsite, surrounded by strings of bright yellow bulbs. I pulled up to a small wooden shack in which sat a man reading a book. I assumed this was the reception. I came to a stop next to the booth and pulled down my window. "Do you have any space for one more camper?" I said to the man inside. He looked over at the campsite and then at his list of people staying that night. "Yeah, sure, we could fit one more. That'd be £40 for one night," he said, as he wrote down my license plate and model into his log. I reached into my pocket and took out 4 £10 notes from my wallet and handed them to the man. "There should be some space for one more in the far right corner," he said as he put the money into the register. "Thank you," I replied as I gently put my foot on the acceleration. I drove by the other caravans, most of which had their lights turned off already, since it was already 10 o'clock in the evening. The sun had set, and the forecast said it'd be a cold night tonight. I turned right when I reached the other end of the campsite and parked my camper into a nice little corner spot. I stepped outside, looked around the campsite, and noticed only one person who was still up, an older gentleman who was cooking sausages on a disposable grill. We both nodded at each other as a quiet and universal sign of acknowledgement. I finally felt like I was safe. Now that I'm here, I realized it was pretty stupid of me to go into the woods alone. It would have been better if I went with a friend, or maybe just set up camp a few hours earlier. But I'm glad to be surrounded by other people now. Still, I had this strange feeling in the back of my mind that I wasn't out of the clear yet. So I thought it'd be best to stay inside my camper, just to be safe. Not to mention, I was dying for a good sleep. So I stepped inside the caravan, closed the curtains, and locked the door. It seems Marcia was already one step ahead of me, as she was cooped up in her fluffy grey bed herself, with her toy hidden just under her paws. I patted her scruffy head and walked towards my bed, Undressing myself and throwing my clothes onto the floor, I collapsed into the soft duvet and said goodnight to Marcia. Good night, Marcia. I woke up some time later. I felt the duvet wrinkles on my face as I lifted myself off the bed. I struggled to open my eyes, since I only just got up. A sense of adrenaline came over me, as when I tried to balance myself to sit up, I felt the vehicle shake almost as if it were moving. The very familiar sound of tires rolling on concrete roads is what led me to jump to such a conclusion. I found it very hard to wrap my mind around it. A moment later, after my mind adjusted to this unique situation, I heard a light whimper coming from towards the front of the camper. It was Marcia. She sounded like she was pretty hurt, breathing lightly and crouched under the shadow of the passenger's seat. I tried very hard not to make any noise whatsoever. Slipping gently off of the bed and onto the floor, I knelt behind the wall so I could see the front half of the camper, and to my horror, I saw the back of the same man from last evening. He was as still as a mannequin and as quiet as a mouse, driving my camper like it was just the most casual thing. He had also stolen my rifle, as I saw just the tip of the barrel lying on the passenger's seat. I looked back again at Marcia. One of her legs seemed to be in an incredibly unnatural position, like it was broken, or at least badly injured. I sat carefully against the wall and looked at the floor around me. I saw a pair of large welly boots. I sometimes went fishing, thinking on my feet, I grabbed one. I aimed it just above and to the left of the steering wheel, hoping to catch him off guard, as I'm pretty sure he thought I was still asleep. I focused my aim for about 10 seconds and threw the boot. The boot made impact with the man's left shoulder, and as soon as it did, I made a run for the rifle as the man wrestled with the steering wheel. Looking out of the windshield as I just about got my hand on the wooden rifle handle, I saw we were heading towards a tree. The camper crashed into the thick tree. Items flew and clattered everywhere, and I heard Marcia's fearful whimpers as I collected myself, still holding the rifle. I aimed it at the man, whose hood was now off, revealing a dark-haired man with incredibly messy hair. He was still dizzy after the crash, so I advanced towards him, cocking my rifle purposefully loud in order to startle him. "Get up!" I shouted. The man got up, still a little hazy from the crash. He stepped out from the seat until he stood about half a meter from me. I smacked him round the face hard enough that he fell to his knees. He spat one of his rotten teeth out. "I'll only say this once. Get the fuck out, or I'll shoot you right here," I said, pointing the rifle between his eyes. He merely stared back at me, with a cold look in his eyes. This wasn't how I imagined this trip at all. First, I ended up getting stalked, then kidnapped in my own van. I definitely hadn't imagined I'd end up threatening to shoot someone. I lowered the gun slightly, probably out of pity for the man. But just as soon as I did that, the man stabbed me swiftly in the leg with a small piece of broken glass. In reflex, and in reflection I suppose as karma, I shot him in the calf. He let out a blood-curdling scream and immediately scurried out of the vehicle and into the still dark night, leaving the door wide open. I heard him whimper as I sat back for a moment, rifle still in my hand. I took a breather and got up, practically limping my right leg across the floor. I rushed into the seat, looked over at Marcia, who was thankfully still alive and hasn't seemed to have lost much blood. I started the van and backed out of the tree it impacted with. I slowly picked up the speed. I realized I was sitting on broken windshield glass, but that didn't stop me. I had to get out of there if it was the last thing I did. And a short time later that night, around 2 or 3 a.m., I checked myself into A&E and treated Marcia myself with an emergency first aid kit. The very next day I took her to a vet in my town. It took us both a couple of weeks to fully heal, But I'll never forget the look in her sweet eyes when that man had gotten the best of her. And, quite frankly, myself. To this day, I consider myself lucky I had even gotten out of that situation. What if I hadn't woken up when I did? What if I hadn't woken up at all? What if I hadn't had my rifle with me? Did that man want to kill me? Or just take my vehicle? I suppose all of those questions aren't really relevant, since I should be glad I'm even alive. And with Marcia too. There's only one thing I know for certain. I'm never going back to those woods again. For I don't know if that man is still looking for me.